I'm thrilled to present Carly Schmidt. And Carly, by the way, a very appropriate surname for tonight's presentation. Carly is the museum educator at the Peter Wentz Farmstead in Montgomery County. Here at Landis Valley, we often place such a specific focus on Pennsylvania German history that's related to the Susquehanna River Valley, Lancaster County, and the immediate area. I'm thrilled that we can head a little east tonight to Montgomery County and explore Farmstead that has an extraordinary history of not only the families that lived there, but a really extraordinary connection to the American Revolution. We know that Pennsylvania Germans settled in a wide area, going to the north of Philadelphia in what's now Bucks and Montgomery County, and going to the west, not just Lancaster, but Chester, Berks, Dauphin, and Cumberland County. But today we'll focus on Montgomery County. Carly is the museum educator. Peter Wentz Farmstead is part of the Montgomery County Park system. She has a double major in art and art history from Wagner College as her BA, and she just recently completed a master's degree in art history and design from the Pratt Institute in New York City, correct?
Yeah.
Great, great. So again, please place your questions in chat. And without further ado, Carly, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. As David said, I'm the museum educator over at Peter Wentz. We're located in Lansdale in Worcester Township. And we are one of 5 county historic sites owned and operated by Montgomery County. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of our site, but with a special focus on the German influence throughout the site. So we're starting our story all the way back in 18th century Germany. So during the 1709 Palatine Migration, roughly 30,000 Germans migrated from the Palatine region in Germany to London, with the hope of eventually moving on then to the New World. They were welcomed at first, but the longer they stayed, the more people started complaining and wondering, how are we going to take care of these people? Where are we going to put them? What jobs are we going to give them? And so sensing that they kind of worn out their welcome a bit, a lot of them either returned home or moved on somewhere else. But about 3,000 of these migrants managed to make it to America. Most of them arrived initially in New York, and a lot of them did settle there. But many started to move on towards Pennsylvania. William Penn was here promising good land at low prices. He was also, promising this kind of semi-utopian community where not only was he advertising religious freedom, but he wanted it to be somewhere that people from all different cultures and different religions could live together peacefully. And so he would often kind of seek out, he sought out a lot of the German migrants and really anybody who was kind of dealing with this religious persecution back in Europe to sort of grow his community here. Now, one of these Palatine migrants was Peter Wentz I. So Peter I was born in 1682 in Gernsheim, near Worms in the Palatinate region of what's now Germany. We don't really know much about his early life, but what we do know is that he is recorded in the London census in 1709. So we can assume that he was part of that major Palatine migration at that time. While in London, he meets another migrant named Elisabetha Ruppert. She was also from the Palatinate in a town called Epstein. And I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but she's near Neustadt an der Hart. But they probably didn't meet each other until they actually arrived in England. The couple was married at the Church of St. Mary le Savoy on June 5th, 1709. There's a print up there at the top of the screen from 1709 showing the German migrants who were worshiping at Church of St. Mary le Savoy. And apparently they still have a fairly large German congregation there today. So, they've been, that influence has really stuck around in that area of London. But sometime after their marriage, Peter and Elizabetha traveled to America, and they're recorded in the Pennsylvania land records as living in Germantown by 1711. At some point after that, they moved to Montgomery County. Peter I was a farmer, technically. He's listed in the land records as being a farmer, but it seems like he made most of his money in purchasing, leasing, and selling land. He owned roughly 2,000 acres of land in Worcester Township by 1743. Now, our Peter, Peter Wentz II, was born in Worcester Township in 1719. He was the third of Peter and Elizabetha's surviving 5 children. Again, we don't know much about his early life, but we do know that in about 1741 or 42, Peter II married Rosanna Margaretha Gemelin, who was another local German woman. The couple would go on to have 7 children together and live their whole lives in the Worcester area. Now, towards the end of his life, Peter I began to parcel out some of his many land holdings to his various children, 300 acres of which went to our Peter II, who began establishing a homestead here by 1744. The house was always full. In addition to Peter and Rosanna, the couple did have 7 children, so some of their children lived here with them at various points. There were a few times when their children would move their spouses in, have their own children. So it was a pretty packed house. Hired help would also live on the property, as would several indentured servants. And at one point, 2 enslaved Black men lived here as well. Now, Peter and Rosanna eventually did decide to downsize, selling the house in 1784 to a man named DeVault Bieber. Bieber would hold on to the property until 1794, when it was sold to the Reverend Melchior Schultz and his wife Salome. Schultz was a minister in the Schwenkfelder faith, which is a German Christian sect that has a fairly large community in the Worcester area, even today. Then 5 generations of the Schultz family continued to live at the farmstead for the next 175 years until it was finally sold to Montgomery County in 1969. Now, the real kind of claim to fame of the house, however, is the events of October 1777. So in the late 1960s, Montgomery County purchased several historic homes with the plan of opening them to the public in time for the bicentennial celebration in 1976. And one of those homes was the Peter Wentz Farmstead. The one thing that each of these sites had in common was the fact that they were at one point used as headquarters for General George Washington. Washington and his troops spent quite a lot of time in the Perkiomen Valley and the surrounding areas during the Philadelphia campaign. And on October 2nd and 3rd, Washington stayed here at the Peter Wentz Farmstead, used it as his headquarters. He was here with his 50-man lifeguard, his aides de camp, and his enslaved cook, while the rest of the army kind of filled out the surrounding areas, which they ended up referring to as Camp Methacton. So he's here October 2nd and 3rd. The Battle of Germantown takes place on October the 4th. So he's basically going straight from the Peter Wentz Farmstead right to the Battle of Germantown. So we can assume that at least some of that battle must have been planned here at the farmstead. After they lose the Battle of Germantown, they retreat back to the Perkiomen Valley, all the way back to Pennypacker Mills, which is another of the county historic sites, sort of our sister site down the road from us. They stay there for a little while and then kind of slowly make their way down Skipback Pike back to the Peter Wentz Farmstead from October 16th to the 19th. And to give you kind of an, for those of you who maybe don't have, dates of battles memorized like me, to give you an idea of where we are in the war, this would be 2 months before the encampment at Valley Forge. So, after they left here, they would start making their way in that direction. Now, although this was a relatively short visit, Washington's presence at the Peter Wentz Farmstead is really kind of the reason we exist as a museum at all today. The Schultz family was very proud of the fact that Washington had stayed in their home. So for the next 175 years that they lived here, they always referred to the bedroom that you're seeing here as the Washington room. This was the room he slept in while he was here. And they kept this room, of course, they're going to do a lot of renovations and updates to the house over time, but this room was kept the most intact because, of course, if you know that George Washington has walked on these floorboards or he's, touched that cabinet back there, you're going to want to keep that pretty much as is. So this was when the county took over, probably the most intact room from the Wentz's time period. Now, the county purchased the property primarily because of that connection to Washington. So when plans for restoring the house were being put together, they decided to restore it back to the 1777 appearance. So although in terms of the history of the site as a whole, the Schultzes certainly were here much longer than the Wentzes ever were, but the county wanted to kind of bring it back to that, representative of that 1777 campaign in the Perkiomen Valley. Of course, however, we are not just some place where Washington slept. We are really a unique and incredibly well preserved and restored piece of Pennsylvania German architecture. So in terms of the property itself, the first structure built here would have been the barn, so that the farm could get up and running and, start making money while they were working on building their permanent living quarters. Our current barn, which you see here, is a reconstruction based on the typical Pennsylvania German bank barn style. Because obviously the property is occupied all the way up to 1969, there were a lot of changes over the years to modernize this property, keep it functional as a working farm. So although the original barn had been replaced with a more modern version by the time the county purchased the property, parts of the foundation survived. So they built the barn directly on top of where it would have been at the time. And the really neat part of that foundation is the date stone, which is, I have there in the bottom left corner, and you can see it's got the initials PW right in the center, and then the date 1744. So that indicates to us that the barn was at least, construction had at least begun by 1744. Then the house was built by 1758. It's a rather large home for its time. It's much larger than it looks from the outside. It's 2 stories tall, plus an attic, a cellar, and an out kitchen protruding off the back. And really, it's very uniquely American structure. It's kind of emblematic of that whole melting pot idea. It's built in what is referred to as German Palladian or German Georgian style, which means that it's a synthesis of these traditional German architecture and design, but with this heavy English influence that was so common and so stylish in the architecture of the New World. The redstone of the house was quarried locally, possibly even on the property. The pent roof, which is right in the middle there, goes, kind of breaks off the first floor from the second floor. That extends around the entire perimeter of the main house or main section of the house, and was a very common feature in German homes, as are the Dutch doors. All of the exterior doors on the house are Dutch doors, even the one that goes up to the balcony there. And that's done so that they can be split open, so that your top half opens up to let in light and air and work basically as a window, while the bottom half stays closed, so you don't have your chickens wandering into the house, or your toddlers wandering out of the house. It's a way to use your space effectively as having both a door and a window at the same time. Another feature on the front exterior that's worth pointing out, at several spots, you can find these carved initials on the house. There's the 3 that you're seeing there. There's more over on the right side of the house. But we don't know that this was necessarily a German-specific practice, but we do know of other German buildings in the area, like the Augustus Lutheran Church in Trapp, that have very much the same kind of markings. We think most of them are probably the initials of architects or stoneworkers who worked on the building, although the IC that you see there, it's very prominently placed. It's right up next to the door, kind of right at eye level. That we think is probably a religious symbol. You often see the IC in Christian contexts, denoting the Greek initials of Jesus Christ. So symbolism like that may have been meant to kind of protect or bless the house, which we can support that theory on the side of the house. So this is the back of the house. You see the summer kitchen kind of jutting out to the back there, the pent roof still going all the way around the side. And then on the summer kitchen to the left of the window there is the house blessing or house segan. The house segan is a flat sort of square stone inscribed with Peter and Rosanna's initials at the top, followed by a blessing that's written in German. I won't bother to butcher the German, but I can tell you that in English it reads, "Jesus, come into my house, never to leave again. Come with thy blessed favor and bring peace to my soul." The Wentz family were Reformed Lutherans, and it's clear that their religion must have played an important part in their lives, as it did for most Germans in Pennsylvania. You see a lot of these German communities here. They are all different, kind of oppressed denominations of Christianity, or the smaller denominations that kind of really have to stick together, Schwenkfelders, Moravians, Amish. So we can imagine that the religious freedom offered in Pennsylvania would have helped the family feel comfortable expressing their faith openly. And then inside the house, both floors of the house follow the symmetry of a typical Georgian floor plan. So you can see this is the floor plan for the first floor of the house, but the second floor is basically the same thing. It's bisected through the middle with a hallway, and then there are 2 rooms on either side, all basically the same size there. Now, a typical German home, your house would be centered around not a hallway, but around a stove or fireplace. The Wentzes, though, are able to kind of have both. So they keep that fashionable Georgian style center hallway while having a central stove on each of the sides of the house. So between each of the rooms, there would be a stove and fireplace kind of jutting up against each other, so that you still have that sort of centralized heating there. Now, when I'm saying stove, I'm not talking about something that you'd be cooking with. It's rather a heat source for the home, kind of works like a radiator would. So it's a 5-plate cast iron stove. We have 2 of them in our in the house. And they were really a staple of the well-to-do German household in the 18th century. It's shaped like a box, so there's the 3 panels kind of making up the sides of it, and then a top panel and bottom panel, and then the back is open, and it juts right up against the wall there. And then on the other side of this wall that you see here is the oven and the kitchen. So you've got your fire is in the oven, so that's you're using as your fireplace. And then the heat from that feeds through the wall, through there's a sort of hole through the wall, and heats the stove. So there's no actual heat source inside of the stove. There's no coal or wood or anything like that. It's all feeding in, kind of siphoning off from the kitchen. So the having the stove on one side and the fireplace on the other advantage of that is they can use the same flue. So there's only 1 chimney on each side of the house. And then there's a second stove that is located in the first floor bed chamber. Now, the stove itself, by the time the county got here, had been dismantled and removed at some point. But during restoration of the house in the early 70s, they discovered several of these stove plates, the original stove plates on and around the property. So the front panel, which is the top left there, and it's dated 1749, that was found at a farm that's just across the road. There's another one in our cellar being used as a window well front. Then the one that you see in the bottom left there was being used as the hearth in an old smokehouse, a 19th century smokehouse that they were tearing down on the property. So they were able to then kind of take these plates to the Mercer Museum, who assisted us in creating molds that could be used to recreate the originals. So this is a replica based on those 3 original panels that we found. Usually these would be highly decorated, oftentimes with biblical imagery. The side panel that you see here which is also dated 1749, depicts the temptation of Joseph. So you have certainly another, religious influence there in the house. So the most remarked upon feature of the house, and certainly I would think the most unusual, is the paint decoration. So these elaborate decorations that you see here they're present in every room of the house except for that stove room that I showed you in the last slide. That's the only plain room. The rest of the house is covered in all of these dots and stripes and patterns. They're mostly, it's found on the dados, which are the part of the wall that is, so the bottom half of the wall underneath the chair rail, which you can see in a few of these images. Although the two kitchens, there's an indoor and outdoor kitchen, both of those, like you can see in the upper right there, are covered floor to ceiling, wall to wall in black polka dots all over it, as is the stairwell, actually. Most of the patterns do incorporate some variation of these polka dots, although there's a little bit more diversity in design up on the second floor, where you see these kind of diamond shapes and these sort of little half swirls. They almost look like a comma. They're mostly, the patterns at least, are mostly painted with black, white, and this kind of burgundy red color. And then the trim on the first floor is that mustard yellow, and then on the top floor is that light blue color. Now, these paint decorations have been kind of confounding visitors and researchers alike, essentially since the property was opened to the public. During restoration of the property in 1974, they wanted to, essentially all they really wanted was to see, strip down all the layers of wallpaper and paint that had been put on in the past 175 years, and see what color the original walls had been painted by the Wentzes. So they hired a paint conservator named Frank Welsh, who, he's stripping back all these layers. And not only does he find the original color of the walls, he also finds all of these decorations. He used microchemical analysis and polarized light microscopy, not only to discover the exact colors, the exact original colors, but also to date this paint from somewhere between 1758 and 1770. So it would have been done shortly after the house was built. There was originally some discussion about whether or not to restore this decoration at all. It's not what you expect to see when you go visit an 18th century home. It's not what the county was expecting to find under all of that paint, or the paint and wallpaper. So, there was a thought of, well, is this too weird? Is this too jarring? Should we just paint it, make it plain so that we don't have to, answer any questions about it, that kind of thing. But ultimately, luckily for us, they did decide to have the patterns restored. And then you can see on the right side of the screen, that's the restored paint in the Washington room. And on the left side is the original paint. So one of the really cool things they did when they were doing the restoration was, in a lot of the rooms in the house, they would put plexiglass panels over top of the original paint. So there are places within the house where you can actually see that original paint, and there's visual evidence that yes, it was actually painted like this. Yes, this really is what it looked like. Now, the whole process of recreating these paint decorations was very complicated. It took somewhere around 2 years to complete. You can see in the photo on the right there, that's Frank Welsh doing the diamond stripes on the hall on the second floor there. To the best of his ability, Welsh did try to recreate the exact patterns and colors using the same tools and techniques that they would have used in the 18th century. The actual paints had to be altered a little bit because the originals did use lead, so that couldn't be exactly the same, but it's as close as possible to the original. There's the section that I've got kind of blown up here. This is one of the more interesting rooms in the house in terms of the paint decoration. It would have been a bed chamber. We call it the loom room. It's where we keep our textile tools that we display. But you can see, not only does it have the red kind of diamond stripes, it's got the red half swirls, but it's also got the black polka dots. And I get a lot of complaints on tours because the polka dots are not in the center of the diamonds. What we think is going on here is not just, the Wentz is kind of going crazy with the dots. It's what we think happened is these are two separate patterns that were on the wall at two separate times. So at one point, it may have been just, it was the white wall with the black dots. They may have decided, let's paint over that and put the diamonds with the swirls on them. So we don't think, though, that the red and the black were ever on this wall at the same time. But Frank Welsh decided to put both on, so you can really kind of see the progression a little bit of, the fact that the Wentz's tastes seem to have changed at some point over time. Now, although we can answer some of our visitors' questions about the paint, things like, is it real? How do we know it actually looked like this? We can't really answer the most frequent question, which is, why did it look like this? It's certainly a divisive paint scheme. Some people love it, some people hate it. It is so atypical of this area that you think, well, it must have come from somewhere. It must be inspired by something. But we really don't have those answers. We have guesses. We think the most likely inspiration for this is that it must have come from some kind of Germanic influence. We have had a few volunteers who years ago actually went to Germany and said that they found houses that were of a similar time period that had somewhat similar paint decorations. But it sounds like even there, if that is where it came from, it was not terribly common. There's also the chance it was just an interesting affectation of the Wentz family. The image that you're looking at here is not actually from the Peter Wentz Farmstead, but this is the 1760 home of Peter's brother, Abraham Wentz, which is just down the road from us. So he, same thing with the stripes and the dots, even the same colors really with that black, white, and red. So, maybe the Wentzes just liked polka dots, who knows? But regardless, I think this is the feature that makes us truly a unique example of Pennsylvania German architecture. It's just not something you see in really any other homes in this area. And we would love for you all to sometime come by and see for yourself. So now that I've talked a little bit about what we are, I'd like to give you a little bit of an idea about what we do here. So we are open for guided tours year round, currently only by reservation for COVID reasons. And not only are we a historic house museum, we're also still a working farm. We have 3 farmers on the property who take care of the crops as well as the animals. We currently have 3 cows, 3 sheep, and a whole bunch of chickens. We also offer a variety of events throughout the year, focusing heavily on farm life in the 18th century. We do living history demonstrations, workshops, kids activities, every year in April, we do our big sheep shearing event where the farmers will shear the sheep, and then we have folks demonstrating different, historical crafts and jobs and things like that. Trying to, especially since I've been here, I've been trying to put a focus a little bit on that kind of Pennsylvania German part of the site in terms of our educational programming, just because, like David said in the beginning, the bulk of our Pennsylvania German historic homes in this part of Pennsylvania are more towards Lancaster County, are farther out west. We don't really have a ton of those in Montgomery. This is really the only one open to the public, at least, that I could think of, or the main one anyway, in Montgomery County. So, we're trying to kind of push that aspect of the site a little bit more lately to, because it is really kind of what makes us unique among the county historic sites. Okay, so thank you so much. And I would love to open the floor for questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Carly. Maybe a couple of points to clarify is early in the presentation, knowing that also it went from the Wentz family to ultimately to the Schultzes. Are there pieces in the Washington bedroom that were kept by all of the families that have tradition being used by the general or president?
Unfortunately, no. So the objects in the house are not original to the Wentz family. Since they lived here for a relatively short time, nothing was kept from them. They are all from the time period. They are all actual antiques, but nothing that was there when the Wentzes lived there. We do have, from just after Peter's death, there was an inventory taken of his estate, which lists pretty much everything he owned at that time. So they tried to furnish the house with items that kind of matched what he has. So if they had, a particular type of desk, we've got a similar one, or if he had, they have a tall case clock, so we have a tall case clock, that sort of thing. I will say that the structure of the house is mostly original. So most of the flooring is original. So those are the actual, floorboards Washington would have walked on. The doors are original. The hardware on the doors are all original. So, he would have been touching the doorknobs and things like that. In that room, especially, all of the woodworking is pretty much original. There's a ton of built-in storage, built-in cabinetry in that room, which is also original, but not, unfortunately, the objects.
The other thing is, it was really fascinating to know that the Wentzes were not Anabaptists, but I think you said Reformed Lutherans in what we often get questions of, and a lot of what we talk about in Lancaster County are the Anabaptists, especially the Mennonites and the Old Order Amish. Do you know, with the Schultzes and their long residency there, were they also Reformed Lutheran? Were they Anabaptists, or is it known?
They were Schwenkfelders.
I'm sorry, they were Schwenkfelders. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I believe pretty much, I know Melchior was, but I'm pretty sure most of the generations after continue to be Schwenkfelders.
Okay. So I do have a couple of questions coming in. A person makes a comment that knowing that painted canvas or floor cloths were kind of popular towards the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, it's interesting that she's making a connection between designs of floor cloths and the design you were showing on the wall.
That is an interesting point. Not something I've thought of before, but it could be that is part of the influence, that they saw the floor cloths and thought, maybe continuing that up the walls. That could be a part of the influence there for sure.
I guess the difference is a floor cloth is a floor cloth, whereas what you're showing on the walls is actually painted directly
Right.
onto the walls themselves.
Yeah, a little bit more
Okay.
permanent than the floor cloth would be.
We have another question, is that on the side view of the barn, pictures you showed, there were thin vertical slits. There, and what's being asked is, why did the barn have vertical slits on the sides?
Those basically act as windows, as far as I understand. I think, you wouldn't want your windows too big for the barn because you don't want, anything coming in or out. So that does, that's their way of bringing light into the barn.
And it's not an uncommon feature in
Right.
other barns throughout the region, both 18th and 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
With the documentation of the Wentzes or the Schultzes, were they dairy sheep farmers? Did they have a variety of animals? Were they crop farmers with just a small collection of animals? Do you know?
Yeah, so they did have sheep and cows and horses. Trying to think of, I would say maybe a dozen or two cows, maybe somewhere close to that for sheep. Can't remember off the top of my head. I'm picturing the tax records in my head, but I can't picture the numbers. But yes, they did have cows and sheep. They also grew flax on the property, I know, as well as some other crops, but flax, I think, was the big one, which is why we have the one room in the house is dedicated to textile tools. We have the loom, some spinning wheels, different, things like that, because they were creating a lot of the raw materials for textile making. So we can imagine they likely would have been doing at least, spinning it into thread or yarn. That's more valuable than just the raw wool or raw flax.
Going back to the painted, the unique painting design, someone is asking, is it possible that it was an itinerant painter who came through, who painted the designs, or is without documentation?
Yeah,
it's probably
it's certainly possible. The one thing I would think is that, it would take a lot of time to paint that many different patterns in the entire house. So I would imagine you'd probably need more than one person working on it. But it's certainly possible.
just in the paper documentation that comes down to you through letters, diaries, account books. I'm guessing there's just not written documentation that supports anything along the lines of the decisions or choices that were
Right.
made or influences. It's there.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Wentzes don't seem to have been big writers. We don't have letters or diaries or anything from them. Most of the information we get about them is through, tax records, deeds, newspaper articles from the time period talking about their lives. All of our information about them is essentially secondhand. The one document I know of written by a member of the family while they lived here it's written by Matthias Wentz, Peter's son, while Washington was here. So for those of you who know a little bit about the kind of encampments in this area, most of the houses that the Continental Army stayed at, they'd come through, they'd eat all of your crops, they'd burn your fences for firewood. They'd steal from you. And apparently Matthias Wentz decided he was not going to get ripped off. So he kept a log of everything that Washington ate or drank or consumed while he was here, and the price, and sent the bill off to Congress. And it's now in I believe it's in the Library of Congress now. And we have a copy of it in our collection, but that's the only documentation I know of from the family. I think it gives you a good sense of his personality. At least he was a pretty shrewd guy.
Is it known, was the entire Continental Army on the property, or was it just a subgroup of regiments, or is it known?
So, from what I understand, it was really Washington and his closest aides and guard on our property, and then the rest of the army was in the surrounding areas. So they took up quite a lot of space. It's possible they may have even been, it was 300 acres that the Wentzes had, so they may have been out, further out on the property. But in terms of the actual home and the area directly around it, it was Washington. Some of his aides were here with him. Hamilton was here. John Lawrence was here. Tench Tillman. So a number of the kind of big names in terms of his aides were here with him as well.
Great. Time to do a performance of Hamilton
Yes.
on the ground. One of our audience states, because of the long association of the Schultz family as Schwenkfelders, is that there are a few samplers in the house from the Schultz family, and that the Schwenkfelder Library and Heritage Center has some items from the family house, including blanket chests.
Yes.
In another organization not too far away, there's pieces from a latter generation.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that there were 2 enslaved people that were documented as being owned by the Wentz family.
Mm-hmm.
Is there much of, or any documentation of those 2 enslaved peoples? And then later on in the 19th century, with the Schultzes, was the farmstead ever documented as being a way station on the Underground Railroad?
So we are not, as far as we know, part of that kind of formalized, organized Underground Railroad in the 19th century. But we were just earlier this past year, it was announced that we were put on the National Park Service's, it's called the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, which used to be, focused on sites where that actually were part of that, formalized Underground Railroad. They've now expanded the definition to be about anywhere that there were enslaved people who made an attempt to escape. And you're asking about, whether we know much about the 2 men who lived here. The second man we know nothing about, other than that he's listed on the tax records. But the first man was a man named Jack. And the reason we know anything about him is because he did escape twice from the farmstead.
Oh.
So he escaped in 1766. There are 3 ads in the Pennsylvania Gazette that relate to Jack and his escapes. The first one is a reward posted by Peter Wentz, describing Jack and all the clothing he was wearing, because that was stolen property. Then a few days after that's posted, there's a response from a man in Burlington County, New Jersey, who's found Jack, and basically, says, come get him or I'm going to sell him somewhere else. So he is brought back to the property, which we know only because he escapes again 3 years later. Christmas Day of 1769, he escapes again. This time, it's another reward posted in the paper. it goes into a little bit more detail in terms of not just describing Jack, but it also, at the end of it, Peter Wentz is basically saying, you know, this man is claiming that he has my permission to seek another master, but that's a lie. And then kind of a postscript at the bottom, you know, saying, talking about how any vessels who pick him up are, you know, breaking the law. It was not entirely uncommon at that time for escaped enslaved people to join the crew of ships, merchant vessels, things like that, because it was an easy way to kind of get out, you know, get far away from wherever you had been. People didn't really ask questions on ships, so there's a possibility that that's maybe what happened with Jack. But that last ad is the last record of him at all. All we know is he never returned here. Hopefully, you know, we certainly hope he escaped to freedom, but there's every chance that he died in the attempt, or that he was caught and sold somewhere else. But yeah, we like to certainly hope that he managed to get away.
Fascinating, fascinating. Final question. Is the kitchen garden located where it originally would have been?
We think so. I don't know if we've got evidence of exactly the exact location, but it would have been, you know, pretty close to the house, but especially, you know, right, very close to the kitchen, just in terms of convenience. And there's not really a better, you know, I can't think of anywhere else that would have been had enough space for it. So as far as I know, it's at the very least, it's very close to where it would have been.
Okay. Well, Carly, thank you so much for your presentation. For those of you online, I posted 2 links in chat. The first is the website for the Wentz Farmstead in Montgomery County. The second is know that we receive support for our work through the Landis Valley Associates, including the subscription for the Zoom platform that we're on tonight. If you would like to help the associates help us meet our mission, there's a link in the chat to provide a donation. We will be having more virtual lectures next month. We're actually hoping to focus on the Schwenkfelders and have someone from the Schwenkfelder Heritage Center speak to us on who are the Schwenkfelders. Also, I urge you to all go to our website, and we are now offering 2 hands-on Lifeways classes. We are offering an introduction to blacksmithing in February and March, limit of 4 people per class, and an introduction to authentic hearth cooking for the late 18th and early 19th century. If you go to our website, landisvalleymuseum.org, we have links at the bottom of the page. Take a look, sign up, because we can only accept a limited number of people. Thank you for joining us on this cold January night for this extraordinary insight to a really unique place. So thank you, Carly. I know I visited it myself, and I can't think of anything exactly like it in Lancaster County. So get out there to Lansdale and take a look. So thank you all for joining us. Have a warm, toasty evening, a good weekend, and hopefully we'll see you back on Zoom next month. Good night. Thank you again.
Thank you.